In this first video, we will overview the third alternative process, show you how to arrive at third alternatives. We'll also touch on the first step in that process. Usually when you get into a fight or a quarrel with somebody, you go through 4 phases. The quarrel starts when you ask the other person for more than they're willing to give. Your young teenager asks if you can take the car and you're not willing to go along. You ask your boss for a raise, but she balks. The second phase is when everybody justifies themselves. Your teenager asks, "Why can't I take the car?" You give your reasons against. He rebuts them. You try to justify your request for a raise, and the boss rebuts you. This phase can go on for a long, wearying time. In the third phase, the quarrel disintegrates into haggling. You say to your teenager, "All right, you can take the car if you'll pay for gas, wash it, call me every half hour," and so forth. Of course, your teenager bargains back at you. "Will you pay half? Can I wash it next week?" and so forth. Finally, in the fourth phase, the best you can hope for is a compromise. He gets the car, but he's mad because of all the extra chores he has to do. You get some concessions from him, but you still worry about his safety. So what's wrong with this? You ask, isn't compromise a good thing? You give up something you want, the other person gives up something he wants. This is called a lose-lose outcome. Compromise might satisfy the immediate issue, but nobody's ever delighted by a compromise. It certainly doesn't strengthen your relationship, and it usually solves nothing in the long term. The third alternative is actually the opposite of a compromise. A compromise is a lose-lose. A third alternative is a win-win. You're delighted by a third alternative because it's a lot better than anything you've thought of before. Let's see how the 4 steps of the third alternative process differ from the 4 steps of a quarrel that we've just looked at. The first step in going for the third alternative is to ask this magical question: are you willing to go for a solution that is better than any of us have come up with yet? This revolutionary question drains away all the negative energy. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm simply asking if we can look for a solution that's better than mine or yours. If they say yes, your next step is to ask, what would better look like? The idea is to come up with a clear vision of the future you really want, of the job you really want done. These we call your criteria of success. Once you've defined your criteria of success, you start looking for third alternatives that will meet the criteria. We're looking for a blossoming of new possibilities. You'll know you've arrived by the excitement in the room. The hesitation and the conflict are gone. The third alternative is not only inspiring, but wonderfully practical. We know it will work really well. Let me illustrate how this process works with this story about a third alternative manager. A young man was new at his job. After a few months, he felt he was getting paid too little for the work he was doing. So he took a real risk and went to talk to his new boss about a raise. He didn't know her very well, and she didn't really know him either. But she invited him into her office, and he explained why he was there. Although he hoped she would say yes, he expected her to say no, and he was ready to haggle. But she surprised him by doing neither. Instead, she sat back and said, "Tell me more." So he talked quite a lot about what he'd been doing for the firm, and she listened. She asked him what he thought about the company, its customers, its products. It was odd. He thought the conversation was going to be about money, but instead, it was about him. Then she asked about a certain customer he'd been working with. She wanted to know his ideas for expanding their business with that client, and he did have some thoughts to share. A couple days later, she invited him back into her office. 3 or 4 other people joined in, and she had put up on a whiteboard his ideas for the client. They had quite the discussion. He was excited when they offered him an expanded job with higher pay and responsibility for a new level of service to this important client. The eventual result was a whole line of business, and the young man was ultimately responsible for doubling the size of that firm. This boss had a fine capacity for third alternative thinking. How easy it would have been for her either to refuse his demands or to just give in to them. Instead, she is always looking for the possibility of a third option, a dramatic win-win. Now, in our next video, we'll look at the next step of the third alternative process, which is to find your criteria of success.